Awesome. Good morning. How's everyone doing? Good. Enjoy the keynote? Yeah. Sorry, I was a couple minutes late. Keynote was running late, but we are here now to take a look at what's next for Salesforce Well Architected. So my name is Susanna Plaisted. I am the Senior Product Manager for the Salesforce Well Architected framework, and I'm really excited to share where we've been and where we're going. Who here has already heard about Salesforce Well Architected? Raise your hand. Okay, cool. A lot of folks. So we'll breeze through a little bit of context setting, but for some of those who haven't heard about it, we'll just share a little bit of the history. So of course, our forward-looking statement. And I wanted to start by, of course, saying thank you. Thank you to everyone who raised your hands, who's contributed to Salesforce Well Architected, who's watching online. If you're watching this on demand, thank you for committing to your learning. And of course, thank you for everyone here in the theater today. So for anyone who might be watching or here that doesn't know what Salesforce Well Architected is, at a high level, Salesforce Well Architected is how you know that you're designing things in the right way, in a healthy way, we like to say. And it's a series of frameworks, and it's a framework and a set of tools. And what sets it apart, because there's a lot of documentation, right? There's help docs, there's Trailhead, we have like all the documentation at Salesforce. But what sets it apart is that this is a really opinionated set of guidance. It says in Well Architected, here's our stance on how you should approach things, not just here are all the options. And it was built by some of you, by folks who are architects in the ecosystem. But it was also built with the guidance and the knowledge of folks who work on our engineering team. So people who work and see all of like the logs that come in when you do bad things or when something is broken. And they're learning from those things that you should avoid to do. And then we're codifying in Salesforce Well Architected what you should do instead. And at its core, Well Architected is a set of values for architecture at Salesforce. So it's trusted, easy, and adaptable. And that's sort of how you can approach your architectural thinking, how you can prioritize what you look at and what you commit to. And Well Architected was released back at Dreamforce in 22. It was updated in June of 2023. At that time, we didn't have a dedicated product manager for this product. But we're doubling down, we're investing in this product because we've heard that a lot of you are using it and you want it to be updated more. You want it to be accurate, you want deeper anti-patterns and patterns, and we'll go into what that all looks like in just a moment. I also wanted to share with you today that Salesforce internally is using Well Architected. So I wanted to share some of the pilot customers and just a high-level, quick-glance learnings that we're hearing from folks who are trying to use this framework and set of guidance with some of our most complex customers. So here is just a selection of some of our, what we call early adopters of the framework. So these are pilot customers who have long-standing, existing, complex implementations that have needed some help from maybe our engineering teams, from our customer success group. And we've armed our folks internally that are working directly with those customers to look to Salesforce Well Architected when there's a signal, when there's something happening in the org, when there are issues happening, to try and map it back to Salesforce Well Architected to figure out what that root cause is. And we have a lot of metrics that I'd be happy to share. But two I thought were quite interesting to share with this audience today and online is the fact that we always think about availability as, is Salesforce up and running? Is it that 99.5% availability? But some of you have probably also heard that availability is a shared responsibility between Salesforce and its customers. And we hear that, and sometimes I hear that, and I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, we know that's what you say, but like, how do you actually control that? How do you prove that? And we found with following some of the patterns and avoiding the anti-patterns in Salesforce Well Architected that we can actually move that needle. It might not look like a lot, but we can move that needle on experienced availability. So making sure that you don't have timeouts, making sure that there aren't those issues with latency that exist and happen when your customers are using your application. And on the other side of the screen, you can see the 70% improvement in API call performance what we found here is not that we wanted to have fewer API calls or anything like that. There was actually almost a red herring, a signal that was maybe there's too many API calls. But when we dug under the hood, yeah, there are probably a lot of API calls. These are big customers, right? But we found that the issue was actually these long-running transactions. Long-running transactions were happening, and then at Salesforce, we were actually throttling those transactions. We were saying, hey, something is going on here. We're going to reduce the amount of calls that you can make. And so that was slowing down the process. So by moving some of those processes from synchronous Apex to asynchronous, maybe a platform event structure, platform event in the middle, we were able to improve the overall API call performance. Okay, so that's just sort of like a couple of customer high-level stories, but let me show you now how we're thinking about well-architected this year with all of those learnings we took from our customers. So the first thing that we heard this from those pilot customers I showed you. We've heard this from folks here at other events. The fact that what you found most useful out of all of these like white papers, if you've seen them, they're like very lengthy documents, long reads. What you found the most useful are actually the patterns and anti-patterns that are currently or previously buried in those white papers. And it was hard to go and find them. So what we released now, January 2023, so not too long ago, a tool called the Pattern and Anti-Pattern Explorer. So this is our first step in making it easy for you to consume what you've told us is useful out of the Salesforce well-architected framework. So with this, you're going to be able to get those patterns and anti-patterns, those best practices, fast, diagnose your org, like we saw those customers, or we heard those customers do, and then also filter and just really narrow in on what pattern you're looking for, and also export lists of patterns and anti-patterns to get started faster. So what I wanted to show you is I'm going to come over behind this podium and show you the new release, the architect.salesforce.com page. Let me zoom out a little bit. What's going on? Okay. So if you haven't been to architect.salesforce.com, Well Architected is one of the resources that exists on this page. So we're going to go here. There's sessions across TDX about the other areas, diagrams, decision guides. We won't go into that today. But what I wanted to show you is, of course, the framework. So these are the white papers. If you haven't read them, if this is all new to you, definitely encourage you to read through this really valuable guidance. But the cool thing that is new for folks who have been around well-architected for a while, again, is this Pattern and Anti-Pattern Explorer. So what I can do here is I can, of course, search by keyword if I wanted to, but I can also say, I'm just really interested in, perhaps after this TDX with all the focus on AI, in ethical standards. Like my company really wants to talk about ethical standards and what I should be avoiding or what I should be doing. So here you can see a selection of patterns, so what good looks like when you're implementing generative AI, just as an example. You can see the pattern, what's good, where it should exist, so where you can go look for it, and then also the sort of breadcrumb to the academic guidance about why this is a pattern, or why, for example, on this might be an anti-pattern. And as I mentioned, you can also export these in a couple of different formats, and we're looking at expanding this to include more useful information to make it not just like a pattern generator, but also how do you then diagnose? Once you find an anti-pattern, for example, what do you do? What's your next step? So that leads me into what a lot of you are probably here for today, is what's next for Salesforce well-architected. So one of the things is that we want to build on the momentum that we've had so far. So we've had the early success with our pilot customers. We have lots of folks using the framework and telling us that they like it, but we want these other things. We want it to be more actionable. So we're planning on sort of getting more of a lot of these things. So more pilot customers here at Salesforce that we're learning from and adding to the feedback, the patterns and the anti-patterns, and then also just get more folks aware of what the resources are and get their feedback on how to improve things like the Pattern and Anti-Pattern Explorer. And very specifically, so my V2 Mom, for example, for this year, is prioritized on two main areas with Salesforce well-architected. So the first one is increasing the breadth of the well-architected framework. So when we launched it 2 years ago, it was focused primarily on what we refer to as core and near core services, so things like sales, Service Cloud, the things we know and love. But as we all know, we heard the keynote, things are changing with our suite of tools. There are new tools that are quickly coming on board that we need to include. And there's old tools that maybe we didn't include in the original framework. So this year, we are going to increase the breadth of the framework to represent and to include Data Cloud. So that's a big change, right? When we launched Salesforce Well Architected, the way I would always talk about it with customers is that this is how to prioritize and optimize your time, because Salesforce is not a consumption-based product. Now we have a couple of products that are consumption-based. So how do we represent that best and make sure you as an architect can make smart decisions about utilizing these new tools? We're also expanding to industries, dipping our toe into industries world. So we're going to expand the framework and maybe make changes to how the framework is represented to include, first, Financial Services Cloud, and also Communications Cloud. But we also know that there's work to be done with the stuff that we already have, right? That's sort of like what we want to expand to, where we want to go. But we also want to add depth to the patterns and anti-patterns that exist. Because that's one of the first things that we heard with those 3 pilot customers I showed you on the screen. We heard from our engineering teams, from our customer success teams who were trying to use the framework. This is great, but I need like a deeper grain, a different grain maybe, to actually solve this problem. So what we found is that by working with those pilot customers, we can actually get deeper patterns that can make it more actionable for you to solve your problems, for you to quickly triage what's happening with a customer. And specifically, what that looks like for me, and this is like forward-looking statement, this is sort of how we're thinking about it, but what we want to do this year regarding depth is we want to define the structure. So we want to make sure that whatever structure for patterns and anti-patterns is specific enough so that you can actually use it in your day-to-day work. We want to make it more actionable. I'm also looking at the process of potentially classifying patterns. So right now, the previous slide, I think it said we have 846 patterns or something, almost 1,000 patterns. As we're adding to them, right, that obviously that amount of patterns is going to grow. But then how do you sift through, right, thousands of entries, like if everything's the same importance? So I'm very interested in classifying patterns by, my initial thought was frequency, maybe severity. I've heard some great feedback from all of you already, maybe around the amount of time it takes to solve that. So we want to make sure that we can have a cut of patterns that get at the problem you're trying to solve. And then for me, if we do find sets of patterns that are high priority, that are occurring a lot, how do we then make it easier for you to act on those? And maybe that looks like creating action plans. So instead of just having, you can export the patterns, maybe there's like a white glove, operation for that, a more structured procedure. So when you have this incredibly important pattern, you know how to solve it. For breadth, going beyond the core. So I said integrate Data Cloud to well-architected. We want to integrate industries and learn some early lessons, and then expand to financial services and communications cloud. But we also want to continue to make sure that we're validating with experts, ensuring that quality still remains paramount. So we're going to be, if you are an expert in one of those areas, I'll let you know how you can help. And then finally, beyond breadth and depth. So what's sort of like our visionary, not super visionary, but our sort of things that we're hoping to include, even though they don't fall into these 2 buckets. One of the things, and this is really important, is integration with our own tools. Right? So right now, Well Architected sits off on its own site. We were just looking at it. How can we make sure that this guidance is showing up where you're working, where you maybe even, now this is visionary, maybe even before you make that mistake, how do we make sure that you know that it's a mistake? And we're working right now with our product teams for reliability and security to make sure that Well Architected is represented in tools like Scale Center and Apex Guru. We're working very closely with that team. And then I think it would be remiss to not mention AI, right, in this beyond just AI patterns and anti-patterns, but how are we going to leverage AI to make using well-architected even better. So we're in the process of migrating our infrastructure onto Salesforce so we can leverage all of the AI tools that are being released with the way that we interrogate the database to find those patterns and anti-patterns. So more of a conversational-based guidance experience is something that we're starting to experiment with. And then finally, we want to know, how can we make that pattern and anti-pattern explorer better? Is it useful the way it is? What would you like to see added to it? That's something that we have bandwidth to take on this year. So, how you can help. So I personally want to hear from you about how you're using these tools. So are we moving as the Salesforce Architects team? Are we moving in the right direction? If not, what do you want to see? What have we not thought about that you've thought about? What have we missed? And we also want to continue gathering stories from you. So I shared 3 major customers internally that we know are using well-architected because our professional services teams are working with them. But if you're using well-architected in the field, we want to hear about that too, to get your learnings and to get your experience. And then just in general, if you have any feedback on what you've seen today, sort of where we're looking to go, please feel free to get in touch with me directly at my email or on all of the socials, which is in this short link here. So with that, I think I just want to say thank you so much for spending your first few hours of TDX over here in the Architects section, and online, thank you for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your TDX.